If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay, of course, is the host of Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. He also is the co-host of Hollywood Decoded. It's carried on the Gaia Network. You can subscribe to that network and catch the shows. I believe that's the second season on that yet?
The metrics aren't in yet. It'll be a little while before they make a decision on that.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. And, of course, you are working on a sequel to Esoteric Hollywood, right?
Correct, yes. I'm about fourth of the way done.
Okay. So, Jay, how you doing?
Doing well. I'm glad I was snowed in for 8 days, so I was going crazy like that cabin fever movie. I was losing my mind, and like I said on Boiler Room, I was eating my toenails and chewing the skin off of my fingers.
Lucky you collect your toenail shavings, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I make a necklace out of them. Do you remember that? Have you ever seen Universal Soldier?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, the Dolph Lundgren character is a takeoff on the Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now.
Uh-huh.
And he has a necklace of ears and thumbs.
That was with Kurt Russell, right? Am I right?
Universal Soldier is Jean-Claude and Dolph Lundgren.
Okay, because Kurt Russell made a movie like that too, didn't they?
Yeah, he did. I think it's just called Soldier.
Okay, that's why I'm confusing it though. So.
Yeah, but Universal Soldier is about super soldiers. It's really dumb.
Yeah, it's
that program. Yeah.
So finally the thaw came in, and now you're able to go out and you're mobile again.
Yeah, 8 days that was pretty crazy. And it was 0, negative 10 degrees every day, so you couldn't really go walking, and that's not much fun.
You live kind of a semi-rural area too, so. Right?
Yeah, I was trapped in an ice palace. It was like Peter in Narnia in the Witch in the Wardrobe when he's trapped in the palace by Jadis.
Well, at least your power stayed on and you had provisions, right? So
yeah, exactly, right.
So accentuate the positive there. So, well, tonight
we forget. The weird thing is that it made me notice we forget about how close we are to mortality and nature.
Oh yeah,
because we're so used to conveniences of modernity, and then after 7 days of being stuck inside a ice cube, you realize that, you know, if the power went out, you could freeze.
Yes. Do you have a fireplace?
No.
Oh, yeah. So we have a fireplace, so if enough wood, so if something would happen, we can always do that. So, we haven't had any weather like that up here yet. We've had some cold spells, but no meaningful, measurable precipitation or anything like that. So,
well, actually, in that front, it got so cold that Tallahassee, which never gets super cold, Tallahassee was 19. That never happens.
It must have drove them nuts down there. That's insane.
Yeah,
19 degrees in Tallahassee. Jeez.
Right. I mean, and I don't ever remember it being -3 in Tennessee. I don't ever recall that in my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, that's cold for Anchorage, Alaska in the wintertime.
Yeah.
So, wow. Well, tonight you've done a number of talks. You're continuing this series, this globalist book series. And, with I think this time you covered Bertrand Russell, Edward Bernays, Edward Lilly, the MK Ultra guy, the psychedelic guy, LSD guy.
John Lilly.
I'm sorry, Edward Lilly's the other guy. Yeah, John Lilly. Edward Lilly's the Catholic. And you had a number of talks, which is, I think, somewhat related. You talked about Western civilization and so-called shithole countries, and also this Davos, this World Economic Forum, this Davos meeting, and globalism. So you've covered a lot since I last talked to you. So what do you want to cover first? This globalist book series, these characters and how they're related. They kind of represent a certain class or at least a certain worldview of the elite. So how do you want to go into it?
Well, I mean, being stuck inside an ice cube is good for making videos. There's really nothing else to do. So you have books and videos, but
the viewers watch you go crazy. The viewers get the benefit of seeing you just descent into madness as each day goes by.
I think every video I put up, the commenters believe that I've descended further into madness. So standard fare, literally every time. So, but I think probably since we last talked, we've covered quite a few globalists. You and I did talk about Kessler and H.G. Wells and Jonas Salk. And then I did Charles Galton Darwin's genocide plan for the next million years. Isn't it interesting that we're told that we have to be concerned with empiricism and the immediate data and reason, and then when we read Charles Galton Darwin, one of the top figures of that Royal Society type clique, we get this wild, fantastical science fiction narrative of how there's going to be Eloi and Morlocks evolving in the next million years, which is all just ludicrous.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing next weekend. So, I mean, it's a bold prediction.
It's a very out there book, but setting aside the sci-fi LARPing, he does talk about a lot of the similar patterns that we saw in Russell and other big geostrategy planners. And one of those was right away he talked about attacking the food. So he goes after the importance of altering man through food. And this is another pattern throughout all of these characters that we've seen. Russell said you have to immediately get control of the resources and food. You have to get control of the food is what H.G. Wells said. Charles Galton Darwin says it. And I've read the sermons and different, I've read Sir Francis Galton and I've read Malthus. So I know where these people are coming from. And this, of course, would be one of the main differences I have with the alt-right. So hopefully I'll actually have a couple debates coming up with some fairly prominent alt-right people. And hopefully we'll get to debating some of these topics. But with Galton Darwin, you have this idea that evolution can be commandeered, and that's what we saw with Kessler. Kessler's whole program at the end of Ghost in the Machine was the commandeering of evolution by man. Russell says the same thing. So again, they're all saying the same thing, and so that right there shows you that there's actually a unified conspiracy. It's in the open conspiracy, as we saw H.G. Wells describe it. So DNA, genetics, all of that, rather than actually being something that testifies to a creator and to order and to meaning, for these guys, it's all just something there for man to manipulate and turn to his advantage. And by doing what we mean by this is dysgenics. So this will play into the topics you mentioned in terms of shithole countries and so forth. And dysgenics is the active attempt to mess up the genetic structure and the progeny of some other group of people. So eugenics would be the intent to keep your lineage, your progeny, healthy, safe, secure, in some degree pure. And that can take on many different forms or different aspects. But a lot of people, and this is a real distinction, it's not me making this up, but a lot of people get confused with this because they assume, eugenics means that anything, the left will talk about eugenics a lot. This means anything to do with people group, ethnos, race, et cetera, we don't want anything to do with that. And so therefore anything that talks about that is just there equals eugenics. And that's just simply not true because, for one, I mean, we could talk about Babel and the story of Babel. We don't believe in Babel. We don't believe that there needs to be the destruction of distinctions between people groups. And that's essentially what was happening at Babel, was that it was the blending and the creation of the big blob, to worship Nimrod. And in our view, God divided the nations for a reason in Genesis 10 and 11. So we don't want to go back to Babel, and we necessarily then want to maintain these distinctions. So that will play into the Western shitholes and all that kind of stuff that I talked about in that video. But this, again, does relate to Charles Galton Darwin, because as we saw with the characters like Russell and others, Russell actually, when I got into Impact of Science on Society, which I haven't talked to you since I did that book, there were some really phenomenal statements that in many ways topped what he talked about in Scientific Outlook, because he actually says that I'm worried about Russia. I'm worried about that civilization being a challenge to our dysgenics, radical technocratic scheme that we want to put in place. And so we have to promote abortion. We have to promote, that's why he goes and meets with Lenin. So when you read V.I. Lenin, and when you hear Lenin talking about controlling resources and creating artificial scarcity, he's no different than Bertrand Russell. They might differ on a couple things, but by the end of Impact of Science on Society, you realize that the so-called Western elite liberals and the liberal imperium are just another costume, another mask of the same people putting into play the Soviet experiment. And isn't it interesting that Russell refers to the American experiment, the Soviet experiment, the socialist experiment? They're all experiments to see what's the best way to dominate man. And the irony of all this, and I know people will find this difficult to swallow, distasteful, is that the older forms of statecraft that have existed in Europe, that have existed in Russia, that have existed in Serbia, Romania, which would be monarchia, which would be the oikoumene, the ecumenical notion of the empire, the imperium, that gave man much more status, much more dignity, and man had many more rights and much more freedom. Yes, in an imperium and in a monarchy, men had much more freedom than they possess in the attempts to resurrect or create the purely rationalistic techno state. And that's really what the Soviet experiments were. And so that explains why David Rockefeller can write From a China Traveler in 1973 in the New York Times and say how awesome Mao was. That's why Bertrand Russell can say how awesome the Bolsheviks were. And why were the Bolsheviks awesome? Because they were stamping out Christian civilization.
Yeah, an interesting point there. I mean, you made that point about Bertrand Russell and targeting Russia as an adversary, a stumbling block to the globalist agenda, is that he distinguishes the Bolsheviks from Russia, meaning that the Bolsheviks are agents of the West, of the Masonic West, to destroy Russia, because the traditional Russia is recognized as an adversary to the Anglo-American or Anglophile world, this Masonic world, and that's a lot of people don't make that distinction because even today when they're talking about Russia, they say, well, they're just like the Soviets. Well, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik regime, the Leninist regime, was imported from the West, and that's why Bertrand Russell would say I just thought it was interesting that he distinguished the Soviet regime from Russia. Whereas a lot of people in the West are unable to do that, or were unable to do that during the Cold War. They didn't see that dimension or that level of, I guess you could say, intrigue to the Cold War.
Yes, I was looking for a book. I don't see it, but it's Dr. Richard Spence, who I did an interview with a couple of years ago on his book on Crowley, who as an asset. His newest book, which I've read a little bit of, is intended to kind of be a sequel to the work of Anthony Sutton. So,
really?
What he writes about in this new book is a more detailed analysis of exactly who was funding the Bolsheviks. And yes, many of them were atheistic Jews, and I think that they probably did have a vendetta against the Tsar and so forth. But it wasn't everybody Jew. And not everybody who supported them was Jew. So you have this confluence, this sort of agreement between a kind of vengeful, I don't want to say Zionism because I don't know that they were necessarily Zionists yet, but the Jewish attitude towards, pogroms and the czars and so forth.
This is the Jacob Schiffs, Samuel Untermeyer's, these guys. Yeah. And
I've read Warburg's letters where he talks about the supporting the Bolsheviks. So that's all true.
Yeah, but if you were like, say, you're a member of the Round Table, the Inner Circle, and you have this ethnic group which has some considerable influence and now financial power in the West and in New York and London. These are the people you would enlist in this project because they have a tangible ethnic animosity against Russia. So obviously they're going to be part of the plot and they're going to be very effective. So.
Right, exactly. And so, there's plenty of other interests that are involved in this. It's not just Jewish banking houses, and we covered that in depth in the Tragedy and Hope. But certainly in the background of the British financial elites, you do have Lord Rothschild. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yep.
I covered that extensively in the Anglo-American Establishment book talks that I did, those two. And then that came up in the Davos lecture because or the Davos interview and talk that I did. So anyway, what we have is different attitudes and angers that can be harnessed. So that's how, for example, we wouldn't say, oh, well, Mao's revolution in China was Jewish. I don't really think it was. I think that you had the OSS going and training Mao's guerrillas, and you had Western aid and support for Maoism. And then you have a few decades later, David Rockefeller saying how great Mao was and how great it was to set up Chase Bank in communist China. And that's how Walmart exists. It's because of this. Yes. I mean, this shows you that this is a scam, right? I mean, and I'm really I'm going to start going on the offensive actually, and really starting to debate with a lot of the so-called capitalists and people that are really, because a lot of them love Walmart, and Walmart's a great example of something that was not Sam Walton pulling himself up by his bootstraps, but was something engineered with the aid of the Rockefellers. I mean,
it was the trilateralist plot in the mid '70s to bring China on board as this manufacturing giant, the same time, they're playing games with the currency, with the Yom Kippur War, the creation of the petrodollar. This is going to have long-standing effects on the U.S. economy because as the dollar is enthroned as the world reserve currency because of the petrodollar, it's going to create the macro effect here in the United States. It's going to subsidize imports and make exports more expensive. That's going to lead to the deindustrialization of the United States, which fits this trilateral agenda. At the same time, something like Walmart, you've heard connections of Walmart and also Tyson's Food to Mena, Arkansas, and the cocaine and all that.
Exactly.
It's not this clean cut market process going on here. It gets really interesting. Yeah, to say that.
Well, Russell says in Scientific Outlook, I tweeted this out, got like 500 shares and likes. Russell says here that back in 1931 that the West would be deindustrialized and it would move to China.
Yeah.
He said that in 1931.
1931. Well, if they're writing books like the next million years, writing 75, 80 years later is but yeah, I mean, you've made the point even with China. Was it Sun Yat-sen was a Mason, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That I don't think Quigley hints at the weird intermarriages that Sun Yat-sen had, and then I dug up in separate sources. Off the top of my head, I don't recall, but yeah, he was a Freemason, and absolutely, when we look at the history of Freemasonry, I mean, they've had it in their rituals for a long time to get rid of throne and altar. Mm-hmm. So it's an anti-Christian movement, absolutely. There's no question about it. And in fact, and maybe in the future, we can talk about this, but I'm looking and thinking more lately about the Frankish thesis. Have you heard of this?
No. What is that? I might have just made that name. Let's hear it.
This is an older Orthodox historical theory about what happened in the history of the West, particularly around 10,000 or 1000 AD, and a little bit before and a little after, and it kind of explains why we have the rise of Charlemagne in the Holy Roman Empire, and that this could have potentially been a source of problem, or a source not just of political state problems, but also maybe hermetic issues. And that if you read Hoffman's new book, Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, he focuses a lot on Florence and the Renaissance Hermeticists. And what I'm getting at is that there's a book called Romanity, and Father Romanides has a book on this, who I have a love-hate relationship with. But my friend James Kelly has also written a book on this, Anatomizing Divinity, and we did a couple interviews on this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But the reason I'm thinking that this might be more relevant is that it's not I'm starting to kind of put a few more puzzle pieces together in this older history narrative, where I think that you kind of have these two important periods where you have the rise of the Medicis, and I think Hoffman convincingly demonstrates that is the basis for the influx of Hermeticism into the Roman Catholic Church in the Renaissance period,
and hence usury, right?
And hence usury, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's where that goes, and as we know, sodomy, usury always together. Dante said this.
I've heard. What's that group in and around France? What do they call it? They were commercial banking. I guess they were Jewish, but they were into like international trade and commerce. The
Black Nobility, Venice.
Oh no, I forget what it was mentioned to me. I think Michael Hoffman might have mentioned it. But I think it might factor into this Frankish theory, because it's injection of the justification for commerce, which of course we see in the English world with the Newtonian world, right? This sort of
that's where I was going to go with it. Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay because but yeah, somebody should, I think, probably look into the parallel between the Frankish thesis and the rise of the Carolingian dynasty, and then what you have in the Florentines and what you have in the Medicis and a lot of those Renaissance characters. I think there would be a lot to figure out there. But anyway, the reason that the Frankish thesis is relevant is because it does come at the time. Well, what I'm saying is that the changes in the Western Church happen at a time when you have the anointing of a new emperor. So and I don't think this is debated by anybody, Orthodox or Roman Catholic, but in 800 you have the Pope anointing a new emperor for the West, and this was seen as bizarre because there already was an Orthodox imperium. So if you think about church history, you have Old Rome and New Rome. New Rome being Constantinople, Old Rome being where the emperor previously lived, and then he moved to Constantinople. And the significance of Old Rome really only retained its luster because of the Roman bishop. And then you have Constantinople taking on a primacy, not just because of the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarchate, but also because of the Imperium. This is, of course, during Constantine, right? So for the period of the ecumenical councils of the church, right, from 325 Nicaea and then all the way up to the 7th/8th council in the 9th century in the universal church, right, for the first millennium, you have the recognition of there being one imperium. And that's why the councils are called ecumenical. Oikumene means the extent of the empire, the imperium. And then because of the sack of Rome by the Vandals, the Goths, you have the loss of the political power in 400 in the West. So the papacy takes on naturally a kind of a more important role. This is where you get the rise of the papal states. Right? So, and I'm not faulting. I'm just saying that it was kind of natural given the geopolitical situation at the time. So by about 800, that's why it seems strange to the East that there would be the anointing of a new emperor in the West. Why do we need two emperors? We already have, a recognized imperium. Old Rome has already recognized the Orthodox imperium. But the reason is that there was already beginning to be a theological divide at that time. So what you have then over the next few centuries is the rise of the Franks and the Carolingians. And if we wanted to have a little bit of conspiracy spice, this probably has some relevance to Merovingians. But I don't think that the Merovingians are related to fish gods. I don't believe that the Priory of Zion is real. I think that's a completely fake conspiracy theory. But anyway, but there is a noticeable change in praxis in the church in the West at this time, where you have, again, not debated, but you do have the addition of the filioque to the creed at this time by the Carolingians. The Frankish missionaries are the first to do it in Orthodox areas. I'm saying in Romania, and then you also have the switch to using exclusively statuary in the West, which is an interesting development. Some people have argued that that's related to Platonism. James Kelly has an interesting argument to that effect. And then you have the split between the East and the West, obviously, in 1054. So you have two divergent tracks that the East and the West took. And what I find interesting, and again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a big proof of anything. I'm just piecing together, pretty complex topics, is that what we see is a model of church and state that kind of stays the same in the East. And when you read the decrees of the ecumenical councils and the way that they speak of the emperor, the Orthodox emperor, the imperium, and all that, it's very difficult for me to understand why we would have to have a completely different church-state relationship develop, after 800 AD in the West. And that's naturally what happens in the West. So I don't think anybody debates that there's a different conception, of church and state between the East and the West. So in other words, what a lot of times is accused of the East is Caesaropapism, or the idea that Caesar is the Pope. We would just simply say that the opposite is true of the West, is papalo-Caesarism, that the Pope takes on a role of worldly emperor that was never intended or acted upon in any way like that for the first millennium of the church. Ratzinger writes this way in his book, Introduction to Christianity, where he says that for the first millennium of the church, it was conciliar, it wasn't a papal monarchy, and that really it was over time in the West, in the second millennium, that this came to fruition. Why? I mean, anyway, I know you probably don't want to debate papal infallibility, but what I'm saying is I think we get two different conceptions of not just man, not just anthropology, not just the meaning of the world, but also church and state. So different conceptions of church and state in the East and the West naturally lead to different social interactions and relations between nations, cultures, et cetera, et cetera. The vision of the Orthodox view during the Imperium and then later into post-fall of Byzantium in 1493, you get the church sort of being under the dominance of Islam in the East and having to put up with caliphates and so forth, except in Russia. So you do have the continued acceptance in Russia and Serbia, Romania, right, of these Orthodox Christian monarchs who protect the church. So for me, it's just fascinating that I think that just contained in the symbol of the double-headed eagle, which is not a Masonic symbol, it's not a Scottish Rite symbol, it's an ancient Orthodox symbol of the Symphonia between church and state for the first millennium of the church. It goes back to Byzantium. So it has nothing to do with Scottish Rite 1700s Freemasonry that was appropriated by them. But that's clearly what you see continuing into Russia, for example, into Serbia, and in many of these nations, their flags. We have these traditional images on the flags of these countries. So so the vision of this idea is that there is a harmony between the one and the many. Ideally, yes, there will always be people arguing and fighting. That's unavoidable. But we strive for a harmony between Christian nations and peoples on the basis of the faith first and foremost. But then the different nations and peoples retain who they are. And we can see this in different ways, as evident in the fact that you have historic liturgies that use most of the time cultural expressions of language or national traditions of like, I mean, Armenia, we would say, is in schism. But when Armenia was originally Christianized, it was the church in Armenia. It was the church in Georgia. It was the church in wherever, Ephesus, which is, well, that's modern day Turkey. But what I'm saying is that for the first millennium of the church, the conception is that the national churches meet together and are unified under the banner. Not of a patriarch of Constantinople as the emperor, not under solely one supreme monarchical bishop, but under the college of the bishops at the ecumenical councils, all of which were called by the emperor. So I think that the fact that the emperor called all those councils, I think that's a testament to a different conception of church and state, and that the bishops from these different countries represent the people groups, and the fact that they maintain and continue their linguistic traditions through things like the liturgy. To me, that says that the intention of God is not to get rid of nations, to blend everything into a Babel, but to maintain distinctions, and that we can have unity in the midst of distinction. So, and I know I'm rambling, but I'll make one more point on this. A lot of times when you discuss this, people immediately sort of get triggered and they go into freak out mode. And if they have some kind of biblical or Christian type perspective, they'll retreat into something like Galatians, where Paul says, in Christ, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And quite simply, that is the stupidest argument for why there should not be ethnic distinctions anymore between peoples, precisely because if that is the argument you're making, then it also means that there's no gender anymore, that there should not be gender distinctions, and that there should not be class distinctions. So basically it lends to some sort of social justice warrior communist type perspective, which I don't think most Christians want to go in that direction. But for us, that does not mean that nationhood or that the idea of the ethnos is ever above or that it ever transcends in some mystical way the faith. So for us, the faith itself is first and foremost, should be. And that's why, for example, we can't ever accept things like Teutonic, Aryan paganism, Nazism. Those things are unacceptable. There's some great articles at Soul to East by Ivan Ilyin, the Russian philosopher, rebuking sort of Aryan paganism precisely because it's a return to a kind of biological worship, a worship of biologicization of man, not recognizing that man is more than merely biology. But at the same time, we can also recognize a distinction in cultures. I mean, this should be common sense. All of our forefathers before 1960 thought this way. There was obviously a distinction between cultures. I was just thinking about how Jesus himself has no problem in the Gospels castigating one city as completely corrupt and degenerate. Capernaum, he says, right? How do you think you will escape the gates of hell? Rather, you will be pulled down to Hades, he says. He says, you're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. So in other words, Jesus is not a cultural relativist. He has no problem, castigating certain places, regions as being exceedingly wicked. This should be common sense, biblically speaking. So there shouldn't be this egalitarian presupposition on the part of anybody who takes historic Christianity seriously. To try to think that, because Jesus came, this suddenly means that we're all supposed to be completely equal. That's just simply not true. Number one, because in our physical being, we're obviously not completely equal. Males and females are biologically absolutely distinct in their chromosomes from birth, right? I mean, we are different and distinct in our gifts and our talents and our abilities. So all of this should really be common sense. And it's funny, I was just reading through Proverbs, and I was just kind of taken aback at how I was, back when I was a Protestant, I would read Proverbs all the time. And it didn't even occur to me how many times in Proverbs you have discussion of what it is to be aristocratic, what it is to be noble. In my translation, I'm sure, it's a different translation, but the same idea is there. What it is to respect the king and to respect authority. All these principles are biblical. And a lot of times, how can that be true? Because the Israelites wanted a king, and right, and God castigates Israel for one. And actually, when you read that, they're not castigated because they wanted a monarchy. They're castigated because they wanted a monarchy like the pagan nations around them, so that they could basically fall into a kind of king worship, which is what happens in the books of Kings. Mm-hmm. But when you go back to Genesis 49, one of the earliest messianic prophecies is that the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. That's always been seen as a messianic prophecy. The scepter being the royal lineage, the Davidic line is already being predicted there in Genesis 49, and that it won't depart until Messiah comes. And what happened when the Messiah came in 70 AD? The temple and the monarchy were destroyed in Israel by the Romans. So that's actually, I think, a very strong proof of not just Christianity, but also, the general testament in the history of the biblical presentation towards monarchy, towards hierarchy. And that's why the church and the nations that the church Christianized for the first millennium, and even still today, roughly, this form of government is what just became the norm. So, there's no republicanism or Sovietism in the Bible. And I was listening to some trad podcasts and some alt podcasts, and shows very recently, and they were holding up people like Julius Evola and saying, "Here we go, here's the model." And I'm sitting there thinking, Julius Evola promotes Crowleyan butt sex, so I'm gonna hold up this as the model, the Orthodox Study Bible. I'm going to say that a better model would be not just a rank sort of pagan worship of will to power and butt sex, but actually, this is what happens, by the way, in Kings. Actually turn to male prostitutes in the books of the Kings under Jeroboam when the Samaritan religion is set up. So they were falling into the same problems then. But anyway, my point is just that I think we get two rival conceptions of what it is to retain your identity between East and West ultimately. And I'm not being unfair to Catholics here. I'm speaking more so of the West in general, how it now has fallen into a completely Tower of Babel perspective where they want to try to force everybody into a monoculture and destruction of genetic distinctions. I think that's by design. You have countless globalists who write about it being by design. It's not hard to figure that out. But when it comes to the Roman Catholic Church, I think it's very unfortunate that, the more recent statements of the papacy have basically been in line with this kind of globalism of, don't have borders, let the wall. Of course, the Vatican has big ass borders around it, giant wall and guards, but we shouldn't have borders and so forth. And that's just because we've become so immersed in cultural relativism, and that we're bad and we should feel bad, because white people extended, themselves across the globe. We're supposed to feel bad for that. But, that's really a hypocritical. There's no moral high ground by the people who try to take that, because they don't actually have any moral high ground. Number one, because they're moral and cultural relativists. So how are they going to say that it's wrong in it at all? They may not like it, but they don't have a basis for saying it's wrong. But anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone crazy here with this coffee I've been drinking. Rambling.
Well, yeah, on what basis would, say, someone of Aztec lineage condemn the West?
This reminds me of exactly a great thing that came up in philosophy classes in college would be two things: female circumcision and Aztecs. Mm-hmm. This always came up, and I would actually bring it up quite a bit because, you have the feminist professor who's like, literally sweating, what do you do? Because female circumcision, if you say it's wrong, then you're basically saying that culture is practicing something that you think is objectively, morally inappropriate or, quote, wrong.
No, they get more outraged over a perceived wage gap than do over female circumcision.
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, Bat and I at Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah. It's because it's about, again, there's no moral or philosophical logical consistency here. It's all about whatever argument serves your purposes at the time: will to power, intimidation, and these things. So trying to get a rational argument from these types of people is a fruitless endeavor, because that's not what they're there to do. They're there just to use rhetoric and language, ambiguous language. I was reading Billington's Fire in the Minds of Men. Just talking about revolutionary language, it was inherently ambiguous for a reason.
Yes.
You don't want to be pinned down to anything. You just want to make these stupendous. It's like bumper sticker philosophy, right? It's or now it's like what you might put on a tweet or something. There's no.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, the is part of the destruction of the language and
hashtag me too.
Removing of nuance, and it's mindless.
Mindless. But yeah, I mean, it's a great point. How these divisions within the church and the right after the first millennium have these long-term consequences. One, the gradual, infiltration of the Western Church by elements, but I guess as a development, even free Masonic elements. You have, I had a recent interview with David Wemhoff in his book. He takes on these issues. He's written a couple articles on ethnicity and the importance of ethnicity, actually. I was reading it just today, an article on his website, The American Proposition, about ethnicity, about America. How there's no America, there's no nation, America. United States has no ethnicity to it. Right, it's this propositional nation, and then therein lies so many of its problems. the church today it's embraced Americanism, and this is part of this doctrinal warfare that was waged right after the Second World War with people like Peter Grace and Edward Lilly. They wrote up the this part of the psychological strategy board, the doctrinal warfare that was used. They were targeting all the churches, but the Catholic Church proved to be a particular target because it was at that time considered an adversary. Catholic doctrine was considered a problem by the power elite in the United States, but also as a potential asset because of its worldwide reach. Its offices could be infiltrated, and the office of the papacy itself, having so much power, becomes a target. And this might be an argument for more of a conciliar establishment, where you don't have one target, but because of various intrigues in the 1960s and Vatican II and these things, the efforts of Henry Luce and his and the American press, Time Life Empire, they controlled the interpretation of Vatican II, which more or less determined how people would see Vatican II, and from that they were able to infiltrate the church and get things like indignitatis humanae, this idea of religious freedom, and fundamentally changing, although Catholic doctrine wasn't changed, it fundamentally changed understanding Catholic doctrine, which is essentially the same thing from a practical perspective, how it's being carried out. And this notion of a confessional state being primitive, outmoded, this was the work of John Courtney Murray, saying that the confessional state was relevant for a certain time in history, now it no longer is, and the American system is the ideal system, and that's what should be embraced by the church, and the idea of religious freedom and these things is all part of human dignity. And when I was talking to David Wemhoff, I made the point that America, the United States, isn't a Catholic nation. It's not a nation per se. It was supposed to be very decentralized with various states. It was a confederation of states, but be that as it may, the United States is a Masonic Republic. It is what it is. But there were other countries that were confessional, were historically Catholic, like Spain, Italy, and Portugal, and those countries were targeted by the West to destroy the confessional state. And once the confessional state was destroyed in those countries and liberalism was imported, pretty soon you have this sort of this dramatic decline in not only the culture and the economies of those countries like Spain, Italy, and Portugal, where they're no longer, their birth rates are below replacement rate. Hardly anyone's going to church anymore. They're bringing in all the radical, perverted ideas of the West, like gay, sexual revolution, gay liberation, and these things. So there you have it. The proof is in the pudding. And I said this. So and throughout the Cold War, particularly after 1960s, after Vatican II, the Franco regime was ridiculed as being a dictatorial, being illiberal, and in 1978 when they adopted the Western Constitution. After Franco, I think Franco died in 1975, they finally adopted a Western liberal constitution. Spain became a typical, Masonic republic with all the inherent problems. Yeah,
abortion, gay rights, all that. Right.
They had a gay pride parade just this past year in Spain during a Christmas celebration, the Three Kings Parade, which is a Catholic celebration. And the same problems afflict Italy and Portugal, these historically confessional states. But there was a concerted effort to destroy these states, So what they're saying is these states cannot be tolerated.
Yeah, I mean, this has always been the plan of the infernal powers, because they knew that once that they could remove the idea of a Christian state, they could easily try to stamp out the church or co-opt it. This is where you get the theory of the Alta Vendita, which is the document that purports to show one of the Masonic plans to try to capture the office of the papacy. Mm-hmm. John Benari puts that out. I don't know if it's still in print, but yeah, I mean, the Alta Vendita shows, straight from the lodge, basically the Grand Orient Lodge trying to argue that rather than being naive and thinking that the papacy could be destroyed, as many of the revolutionaries thought, why not just turn it into an agent of change? I think that it's pretty obvious that that's what's going on. And when you read a lot of these books, you start to see that, you have Malachi Martin even talking about the grand design. He says that John Paul II wasn't interested in eternal realities, but in geopolitical strategies for the grand design. Now, Malachi Martin is a dubious character, and worked for probably B'nai B'rith or something to that effect. So I don't trust him. But the fact that he's great friends with Paul VI and John Paul II tells you everything right there. They said, "These are my great buddies." And look how great I am in getting helping to get these changes through under Cardinal Bay at Vatican II. So I would say that when it comes to Vatican II, most educated traditional Catholics know that it's not just Vatican II that's the problem. We actually had many years and maybe even a century or two of movements and ideas of change in the Roman Catholic Church that the papacy and these entities publicly at least opposed, over and over since the 1700s with the anti-Masonic encyclicals since then. But of course, Hoffman does make a great point that why did none of these popes call out usury? Isn't it interesting that the acceptance of through casuistry of cases where a usury can be done. And I think that that's probably directly connected to the Rothschilds being the papal bankers. This is what we get into when we focus on geopolitical concerns ahead of, theological concerns. And that's really, I think, what happened in this situation, and why bureaucracy really becomes the new god. Anyway.
Yeah, a modern example, that would be the Roberta Calvary, the Vatican Bank, and Branco Ambrosia, and how the Vatican was embroiled in this drug-running mafia, CIA drug-running operation in order to funnel funds to Solidarity, right? And again, worrying about geopolitics, obsessing on geopolitics, and I guess forgetting doctrinal purity, and also even to ultimately its pastoral duties,
Yeah, I mean, John Paul's hanging out with William Colby. He's not hanging out with, St. Basil.
Or the other.
He's not reading St. Basil. He's reading William Colby's intelligence report.
And the other, what's his name? The other Catholic CIA, CIA, what was his name in the 80s? Casey.
Marsing?
Casey.
Oh, William Casey.
William Casey, yeah, who was, some of the things he's been tied to. But is it interesting? I was Pope Francis. I think it was the last.
Am I right? Oh, wait, am I getting Casey and Colby? Is it? I thought it was Colby came up with the Templars and met with John Paul, wasn't it?
Well, Colby was Catholic. He's a director of Central Intelligence in the 70s, right. And then Casey was a Catholic member of the Knights Templar in the 80s, and he was involved, of course, a lot of intrigues and. Iran-Contra and that, and among other things. In just this last spring, Pope Francis, I think in the magazine La Croix, in a response to a question posed in an interview about separation of church and state, and Pope Francis said, "States must be secular. Confessional states end badly. That goes against it goes against the grain of history," he said. But from what I understand, this is a contradiction of Catholic doctrine about the state.
Yeah, there's no question. Right.
Yeah, historically, the state called for a confessional state where the church was given privilege. Now, if you're not a Catholic or whatever, okay, you don't agree with that. But I'm saying, just from a Catholic standpoint, the ideal state would be a confessional state, recognizing the church as the church, and then allowing for religious. Free religious practice with some reasonable restrictions, because they want to, protect the country from being led astray. Because this comes from the doctrine of saying that error has no right. There's no right. And I guess from the liberal standpoint, this is perceived as being illiberal because we're all individuals and we're supposed to make these choices ourselves. But this goes to the root of the question about
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole idea of liberalism is that it's relativistic. There is no such thing as authority because there's no transcendent. Whether every liberal realizes that or recognizes that is irrelevant, because that's the system that they're proposing. So They may believe on the one hand that there is a God and that there is absolute truth, and then when they try to also be a relativistic, democratic, liberal, quote unquote, those two systems are completely incompatible. If your conception of God is anything connected to historic Christianity, because look, this is not even debatable. There's no question to this. We already have ancient. The Code of Justinian is a Christianized imperium. It's an orthodox Christian imperium that stipulates all kinds of things on the basis of not just good principles in common sense and Roman law, but also from Scripture. So, and the Church Fathers and the canon law and so forth. All of it goes into play in something like the Code of Justinian, or the Institutes of Justinian, as it might be titled. And that would be normative in the imperium. So in other words, there's no debating this. It's already known. It's been known and practiced for hundreds of years once the empire was Christianized. In the East, Constantine is basically conceived of as next to the apostles. We don't literally call him an apostle. It's just a title of honor. But because of Constantine and his successors, the Orthodox emperor actually had the right to go behind the iconostasis, something that was only accorded to priests generally in the Orthodox tradition in the East. But because of the power and because we saw the emperor as a version of divine justice reflected on earth, for the East, it's just absolutely inconceivable. And that's why when I was doing the Tragedy and Hope lectures, I emphasized so strongly the fact that Quigley was right when he was saying early on in the book that the wars of the 20th century were to destroy these ideas, to destroy the idea of authority, to destroy the idea of imperium, to destroy the idea of transcendent hierarchy, and to replace it with the inversion: democracy, freedom, liberalism, equality, all the Masonic dictums that we've been force-fed our whole lives, which are just not true.
Yeah, someone might be listening to this and saying we're advocating monarchy and hierarchy and church, privileged established church and these things. And these things are liberal and they make demands upon the individual to support and respect, and also lends agree to be governed by these institutions in one degree or another. And this is illiberal because we should be able to make these decisions ourselves. Every man is a king. These things, and we should not be subjected to arbitrary rule of a bishop or a king, because it's all arbitrary, because this claim of having some sort of divine right or claim on the throne is all fake anyway. And man will be free when the last king is strangled by the intestines of the last priest, is
that Voltaire or Diderot?
Is something like that, yeah. It's great rhetoric again, but let's think about this, okay? But your claims about Masonic republics and democracy, I can hear it in your voice, is the confessional state can be illiberal. It can at times appear to be arbitrary, I guess. It can. There's certain restrictions on your liberties in such a country, such a state. But let's not give governments in the West a free pass. I mean, there's claims, the claim of us being free and us having the representative government and constitutions. That's a false claim, because the government doesn't follow the Constitution. Mm-hmm. The courts are there to come up with arguments to avoid the Constitution, to shred it when it suits the purposes of the government or the oligarchs. We have bureaucracies. Look at the bureaucracies in the West now, for Pete's sake. Look at taxation. Look at government spending. Look at the public debt. Look at the wars. Look at conscription. We're not free in the West. So we're less free under democracy. We're less free under constitutions. And I think you've made this point in the past with even Hans Hermann Hoppe, the libertarian. From a libertarian perspective, democratic republics and constitutions are a bad deal if you just look at the numbers, because government spending under democratic republics is 10 times more than it ever was under divine monarchies, under traditional confessional states. So from a liberal standpoint, it's a bad deal.
Right.
I mean,
right, because it's things that are contrary to nature. Nature is hierarchical. Things that are contrary to nature don't work.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes they're intended to not work. That's the point of democracy, because it's always been a tool of moneyed oligarchy. And moneyed oligarchy doesn't want prosperity. It doesn't want things to actually get better, or for there to be invention and creativity and the arts and freedom. Democracy, by its very nature, has to constantly subvert and constantly invert and constantly focus on the base, because its whole principle is the baser desires of man and how to control it, because that's how you create the lowest common denominator. Now, in the situation that you were talking about with monarchies and this kind of stuff, and so in the history of the church, you didn't have the church going out and setting up monarchies. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. What you have is the church Christianizing the Roman Empire and being persecuted by the Imperium for 300 years before this famous dictum, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So eventually you have the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and as I try to show in a lot of the recent talks, the evangelical and Seventh-day Adventist conspiracy theory type view that says that the Christianity of the first 3 centuries changes radically after Constantine. None of that's true. You can read all the church fathers for the first 300 years, and they teach the exact same things the church fathers in 300, 400, 500 taught. But I wanted to read a real quick quote here that addresses the point you made from Father Seraphim Rose's book, Nihilism. And this is in my recommended reading page for those that are interested. And he makes the point that, I'll read this quickly here. The blindness of the liberal is a direct antecedent of the nihilist, and more specifically of Bolshevism. For the latter is only a consistent and systematic application of liberalism. It is the supreme irony of the liberal view that it is precisely when it is its deepest intent shall have been realized in the world, and all men will be liberated from the yoke of transcendent standards, when even the pretense of belief in another world will have vanished. It is precisely then that the life as the liberal knows or desires it shall have become impossible. For the new man created from liberalism, from that disbelief, it produces only what can be seen is in the last analysis as illusion, which is what liberalism was originally intended to dispel. So in other words, because it's nihilistic, the original telos of purpose supposedly of liberalism, which was to create a new humanity, a new man, because it ends in nihilism, that is illusory, and it means absolutely nothing. What does it mean to be a new man if we live in a nihilistic world? It means nothing. In the Christian order of politics, it was founded upon absolute truth. So we have two competing, absolutely mutually exclusive views of the world. You can't mix Christianity and liberalism. He says, we have already seen, this is real quick, this is the end, in the preceding chapter, that the providential form that of government that took place in, well, let me read that. Let's see. The principal providential form government took in union with Christian truth was the orthodox imperium, wherein sovereignty was vested in a monarch and authority proceeded from him downwards through a hierarchical social structure. We will see in the next chapter that the inverse is true in democracies. The people, quote unquote, are the sovereign, and they are understood as the, quote, authority that proceeds from below upward in a, quote, egalitarian society. But of course, we know that it's not egalitarian, really. It's egalitarian in name only. But it becomes a tyranny precisely because it's a religious commitment. And that's another point I want to stress to in regard to what you're saying about modernity and liberalism, is that this is even something that nihilistic postmodernists have seen about liberalism, like I just went blank. The gay Jesuit, former Jesuit postmodernists. What's his name? Who's the most famous postmodernist gay Jesuit?
Chardin or
no? He went straight into philosophy, and I think he didn't fully become a Jesuit. He studied it, but he wrote a famous essay I read back in my undergrad days about how modernity, in its attempt to get rid of the idea of hierarchy and pastors, and all it did was replace it with another form. Foucault. Sorry.
Michel Foucault. Okay.
All it did was replace it with another type of hierarchy, doctrine, dogma, right? This is a similar argument that we make a lot with radical materialists, is that it's another religious commitment.
Yeah.
And he's making the same type of argument with progressives and Democrats, as he's saying that, look, you might as well be a postmodernist because your position leads you to nihilism. So actually the postmodernists are more consistent than the progressives and the Democrats.
It was his 1975, I think, at the Death Valley, where he made a deal with the oligarchs where he'd promote sexual liberation and forget any traditional leftist claims.
That's because he was an ardent homosexual, and that's right. I forgot about that. And I think he claims he had some kind of experience and he saw the abyss. He was probably into some weird occult stuff.
Yeah. And he said, the idea is we're poor, but we're sexy. And this gets into this whole thing about, that's something that the whole left, the liberal, the French Revolution, the Pleasure Dome and the Palais Royal that the Duke of Orleans created, and the idea was,
I forgot about that. I forgot.
It's like it's all about the sensual element to it. It's and it's just funny. It gets if you appeal, the direct appeal to base appetites and passions is how they get people to. Well, that's how you enslave people, and that goes in the marketing. That gets in the whole liberal approach.
Advertising, marketing. Yeah, this is. Yeah.
And that gets into, of course, your book, when gets back to the books you're covering, which is Edward Bernays, and his whole thing was about that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think most people are familiar with the basics of Bernays and advertising, but what stood out from that book was how tricky and clever so much of it actually was, and a lot of it sounds very common sense, but when you think of it, it's like, oh wow, so it's like P.T. Barnum. He's like a new P.T. Barnum, almost. Yeah. And he would come up with these big publicity campaigns. Is a thing he kind of pioneered. I'm sure most people are familiar with freedom torches and egg bacon and all that. But one of the things that I didn't know he was involved in was a giant social experiment with soap and the soap.
Yes, the sculpting, yeah,
soap sculpting, which he said. It was really, he even admits how stupid it was. He's like, yeah, this is ridiculous. He's like, but boy, did we sell a bunch of soap by getting people to do soap sculpting.
Yeah. Well, but then he got into, of course, he is, during the First World War, he worked for the Creel Committee, the Committee for Public Information, and with Walter Lippmann, all these propagandists,
exactly.
these liars, and he's the father of modern journalism. So what does it say about journalism?
All this stuff is right out of the OSS. I'm sick of these people. But I did want to make one more point about the idea of monarchy and all that. Is that so? The church doesn't go out to create monarchs. It goes out to make disciples, and that's kind of what the Great Commission is. And Jesus didn't send us out to be geopolitical power players. That doesn't mean that if you're a geopolitical power player, you can't convert to Christ, but it's about what comes first, really. So really, it's just like with democracy. All of this stuff is about putting things out of order the way they should be. You know what I mean? It's like, in a household, you don't make the 3-year-old the head of the household because that's out of order. Household is going to go crazy. There's going to be, poop everywhere and food everywhere. It would be insane. So the father, has a role. Under him, the wife has a role, et cetera, et cetera. And really everything else in the world, in nature, and society has this rough, same kind of structure to it. And ironically, even lunatics like Kessler admit that. They're like, oh yeah, nature is full of hierarchy everywhere. But we got to be radically egalitarians and destroy hierarchy. Well, isn't that interesting? Because that almost seems like, to be consistent, you're going to have to make a war on nature, won't you? Because nature itself is hierarchical, and that's what these seriously deranged Luciferian types, they really do make a war on nature. They really do believe that it's a kind of action of dark power to basically to do something nihilistic like that, to deface nature, to deface creation, to deface humans, to create something GMO. I think is ultimately Luciferian.
Yeah.
Because it's anyway. So, but I back to the point of monarchy. So we basically, all we're saying is that we do have a long-standing working model of church and state relations. I'm not saying that what we do now is that, we're gonna go convert a bunch of monarchs and then force. You don't go top down like that. The conversion process happens through the people. And yes, it could be a monarch converting right away. Who knows? A leader, whatever. But it's only Christianized societies that take on the role of the confessional state. So this is a point I wanted to make, to stress what you were saying earlier, because people are going to freak out and they're going to be triggered and go crazy. We're not saying that we're going to have a Orthodox emperor suddenly in America and he's going to put to death everybody. I mean, that's crazy. That's lunatics. What we're saying is that you have a long process. Usually it takes centuries to convert people. And then comes the idea of the rulership. And in the history of the church and in the history of Israel, that rulership took on a monarchical form. And the role of the ruler, his power, it does not come from the people. It comes through the anointing of the church. This is how it was always done. Every ruler in the West, even prior to Charlemagne in the West, kings were anointed. It was the same in the East. It's called a coronation ceremony. It's been done hundreds of years in Christendom. This sounds so crazy, and people are so like, "What in the world? That's insane." Well, it's been done for millennia now. Nothing new here. But it also doesn't mean that, if I can get online and Google and find a Christian empire somewhere, or maybe I can find a monarch somewhere. Like some of the monarchs that are around today are the worst human beings alive. Yes. So it's not. Yeah, I mean, Nero was the beast, I believe. So it's not like hierarchy and monarchy itself is inherently, and many of those people are just CIA puppets anyway. I mean, the Shah was a CIA puppet. Mm-hmm. Yep. He's supposed to be he supposed to be the reincarnation of the Persian emperor. He's a puppet of the CIA. So many monarchs are in the modern day are CIA puppets and tools and stooges. Remember we talked about, I think one time that you knew more about it than I did. The Daniel Estlin talks about with the Prince of Monaco and Grace Kelly.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that guy was totally screwed over by the CIA and the New World Order and all that. So there's nothing inherently great about monarchy per se, and many of those people are degenerates and wicked people. But what we're saying is, like Father Rose said, is that when a place becomes Christianized providentially, the tendency was always to adopt that form of government because it coincided with the theological worldview. Mm-hmm. I mean, we believe in the liturgy. We sing about the heavenly powers, the thrones, the principalities, dominions. So you have this 9 choirs of the angels underneath God who govern the universe. And that same principle is reflected in not just creation, but also in family relations in the world. And this has long been taught by Dionysius in the Celestial Hierarchy, Saint Germanus and his commentary on the Divine Liturgy. I mean, this is a classic view of things. So there's nothing new here when you actually know, kind of what this is. Our great heritage. We have such a great heritage and tradition, and people want to throw this away for garbage like Darwinism and garbage like atheism and nihilism, and it's just sad.
Well, so from the standpoint of the American Catholic Church, is the proper posture for the church should have been, or would have been, rather, that if you're American and you're a Catholic, there really is no proper place at the table for you for America, because America, ultimately, the founding ideas of America is incompatible with Catholic doctrine. And that's a hard pill to swallow, a hard pill for many people to swallow. But the American state was established. It was a disestablished church, which was something new on the scene at the time. But the America itself was highly decentralized. It did have established state churches at the time. But be that as it may, what happened was that Catholics.
By the way, we still have established church. People don't know this. Because all those CIA people, most of them are Episcopals.
Yes.
So you still have that. No, I'm joking. But I guess the ambition or the desire for Catholics to have a seat at the table. I think Claire Booth Lucy even wrote about this. There's a quote of hers that David Wemhoff talks about how good she writes in a letter how good it is for finally to have a place at the table. To sit at the table with the elite, and this sort of seduction of the American Catholic Church. And he makes the point that this pluralistic society generates a lot of wealth and prosperity. So it's very alluring to a lot of different people. Well, are we going to serve God or mammon?
Exactly. That's what we have to get to. It's the ultimate question: is what is a good society? And this is largely subjective, but again, it's not about making more money. Having more perceived power in these things, and that's where the church and the American Catholic Church became the Catholic Church became Americanized, and that's when it was utilized. I think it was Henry Luce who realized. He gave a speech in the late 40s about American Catholics being much different than other Catholics, and then America's position in the world after World War II with its victorious dominant power of the empire, and they could use that the prestige of America. And use more or less Catholic frontmen to go out and infiltrate the church and use church offices throughout the world to spread globalism, Americanism, which is globalism, this world economic plan, which Henry Luce wrote about. We all see came in the fore with the Bretton Woods system and these things in the 70s with the petrodollar and the whole idea of globalism itself is this part of this world economic plan. But he made the point that a lot of Catholics will be offended by the policies in China vis-a-vis the Catholic Church because they suppress the Catholic Church in China. And he says, well, it's not so much Catholicism that the Chinese Communist Party is worried about. And the Chinese Communist Party really is represents the ethnic Chinese, for better or for worse, as it stands now. Yeah. And they're afraid of liberalism being injected into China via the Catholic Church. So, and that was a great point.
Right. Now, I'm no fan of Chinese communism or anything like that. I think it's a wicked system. But that is an interesting point, and it is true. And I think once you understand that, I think you've made a big step forward in understanding how the modern world actually works.
And you have to understand dialectics, right? Yeah,
exactly.
Multi-level dialectics.
Yeah, it's just like Russia banning the Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, some other weirdo cults. I would say that is a step in the right direction, precisely because they recognize, and they even say this, that those can be tools for intelligence operations.
And they are.
Absolutely.
The CIA has a long history of exploiting cults and religious groups. I mean, come on. Scientology itself has ties back to naval intelligence, even going back to Crowley, correct, which is British intelligence.
Right, exactly. And then with Hubbard, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it actually makes sense why they would do that. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese regime is virtuous or good or whatever, but it means that a lot of Catholics who would be buying into Cold War dialectics, reading National Review and the Glenn Beck are going to think that it's just because they are atheists. But there are, that's what an arrogant thing to think that nobody else in the world has any understanding of the fact that it's actually dangerous to allow these things like we saw in Ukraine once the West got into Ukraine. It's dangerous to allow these the tranny marches and the gay marches and all this stuff and the exportation of this stuff that, I was talking to a guy who was in Iraq, and he was saying, yes, what you said on Boiler Room is 100% true. The weaponized porn that you see in Men Who Stare at Goats at the end of the movie when they're talking about, he said, I was in Iraq. That's real. It's true.
And that's what the Israelis did in Ramallah when they occupied it and imposed a curfew and took over the television station and started telecasting porn.
Saying that, like Skinamax suddenly comes on or something.
Yeah. And they don't recognize cultural aggression in these things. And that's another thing is we're getting in the areas of some people, this is too subjective, you're being too prescriptive with these things. But, the weaponized culture is there, and it's not, it's not as if you can just turn it off.
I wrote a book on it. I have
Hollywood,
I have my master's thesis was on this topic of how to weaponize pop culture. So, maybe I'm an expert. I don't know exactly what qualifies it, but it's a real thing, and absolutely 100% they know how to weaponize culture. But that's absolutely tied to the cults and shells and fronts and using things for other reasons that most people don't recognize.
Well, look at it. The moment Spain liberalizes in the 1970s, all of a sudden the culture war gets injected into Spain. Coincidence? Right? There's a coup in the Ukraine. All of a sudden they get tranny queer parades in the Ukraine, destroying traditional Ukrainian culture, Russian culture, Slavic culture, these things. And so, is it just a coincidence?
Right. No, not at all. And that's why it's so hard to get that across to libertarians and people that are fans of Americanism.
This is what I wanted to get you. We often hear about cultural Marxism, and it's very important. Mm-hmm. I've heard the term cultural capitalism.
Yeah, I keep trying to come up with a good term. That's a good one. Yeah. I've been calling it corporate communism because I want to distinguish it from fascism, because because even in fascism you could have private property and a family. Yeah. That's actually under attack.
You can also have traditional. Because I don't think the regime of Mussolini would be so arrogant as to start promoting tranny stuff. And
that's what I'm saying. You could have a family private property under Mussolini.
But there is something corporate capitalism. This goes back to that whole thing with what Wemhoff was writing about, how this is all part of a world economic plan.
Right? Yes, and that's what Davos is.
Yeah. And this is breaking down culture, because you have to break down local cultures and traditions to facilitate markets. Mm-hmm. If you want to just boil it down to a business plan, I think it's something more sinister than that, because it just gets the whole thing with the opium wars and promoting drug addiction to destroy the culture, to soften up the culture, to manipulate it, to ultimately to enslave it, to inevitably turn the whole China into a bunch of factories and these things. So same thing with Latin America, with the whole economic hitman model, where if you destabilize a country, you keep it from developing its resources, you can buy up on the cheap, you can impose something like the Bretton Woods system and the petrodollar, which is based on debt and inflation, so you can indebt these countries while you're enslaving and impoverishing them, using the labor and the resources of the country as collateral, so you can claim that. Right. At the same time, if you destabilize, the labor becomes cheap, and all of a sudden you have cheap labor for your factories as you're deindustrializing the United States. Pretty sinister, but they're doing it. And then the libertarians will say, well, this is just the market. Walmart's great.
Exactly. Yeah. Peter Schiff's always talking about how great Walmart is.
Yeah.
So Walmart's great.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, on one level I get his point. I don't want price controls, this stuff and all this. If I believe the sound money, that's good too. That would work. But then again, if men were angels, fiat money would work too, right? So, it's not. Again, we're getting back to a spiritual, moral. It gets back to the question: what's a moral, just society?
Well, see, here's the thing, and this is a point where there would be agreement and disagreement with somebody like Dugan. And I keep getting people asking me, why are you a Duganite? I've already talked about this many times, but Dugan on the one hand wants a form of cultural relativism where maybe we can guard against tyranny by allowing decentralized cultures to do their own thing. But that runs contrary, number one, to the traditional Orthodox view of there being absolute truth. I mean, that's what Father Rose was saying, is that the traditional development of our view of church and state became Orthodox imperium. So imperialism necessitates the idea that there is one absolute truth. There is no cultural. Let me put it this way: there is a sense in which there's cultural relativism, and that's why the imperium has always allowed different liturgies, different languages, different practices, and so forth that don't conflict with divine positive law, as you pointed out earlier. I completely agree with that, and we agree with that. For us, the divine positive law is, we would share this same principle with Roman Catholicism for the first 1,000 years, and you're bound by that. Your nation can't, for example, institute bestiality. I mean, this goes against moral law. It goes against positive divine revelation, etc. So on the one hand, there is a universal aspect to this absolutism, but that is also not a dialectic. We always want to and this is what you see in the ecumenical councils when they're hammering out Christology and when they're hammering out the Trinity, and ecclesiology, they're wanting to avoid dialectics. We don't want the one to be set against the many. There have been some great philosophical books that have been written about this, and it necessarily, your worldview will necessarily be your society's world will be reflected in the social order. So the social order will have either a striving for balance between one and many, or it's going to tip over into one or the other side, and you're going to have the anarchist saying that it's all got to be the individual, or you can have the collectivist saying, we're all under one, or the imperialist says, our Teutonic racial dogma says that we are the chosen God race through evolutionary principles or whatever it is. But we would say none of those are true, because those are all relativistic, and that we actually have a specific revealed anthropology and a revealed doctrine of how we ought to strive for our church-state relationships to be. And they don't, at least what we strive for is that we don't want them to be out of balance. We don't want there to be a loss of the richness of the diversity of different cultures. Mm-hmm. That's why there is the Tower of Babel being dismantled. But we also don't want there to be total relativism. What I was going to say earlier when we were talking monarchy, what do we constantly read in the book of Judges? This is a great testament. Even if you don't believe the Bible, you can read the book of Judges and see this principle of wisdom that throughout, at the beginning of the book and the end of the book, you have the statement, and there was no king in Israel in that days. And let me restate it. There was no king in Israel in this day, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So the decentralized democratic stage of Israel's development was relativistic, and it was chaotic, and it was nonsensical. And then when we see the birth eventually of the kingdom period, yes, there's a lot of bad. There are some good kings, David, Hezekiah, etc., Josiah. But the point is that you get order. And throughout Scripture, God prefers order over disorder. I mean, heaven is not disordered. I think Father Rose makes this point too in his nihilism book, is that heaven is order and hierarchy, and hell is an egalitarian chaos.
Yes.
So, but of course, you're not actually egalitarian in hell because I guess you're under the devil. But yeah. So I mean, these principles that we're discussing. What's so amazing is that our forefathers, the ancients, what Proverbs said, don't remove the landmark of the ancients. That we've already been through this kind of stuff. Like, we've already been given wisdom on these subjects, and we're now having to almost kind of reinvent the wheel because of the idiocy.
Well, it's liberalism, right?
Of liberalism, exactly.
It's liberalism. This is the sort of the reductio ad absurdum of liberalism, the
Yes.
logical conclusion of liberalism, because if you can all do your own, the church will sit back and the culture war issues, gay rights, abortion, and they'll have their protests, and they're allowed to have their protests, and they don't bother anybody. It's good for fundraising. It ultimately doesn't have any effect on public policy, and everyone goes home happy. They can feel good about themselves for opposing abortion, and they can tell themselves, they're comfortable within their own conscience that they oppose abortion. But that's it, right? That's pretty much it.
Well, even the liberal Father Alexander Schmemann, who I don't have the greatest appreciation. I did it one time. I liked him when I was new to Orthodoxy. I read his liturgy book and his Bread of Life, or his Eucharist book, a long time ago. But even he could recognize that the principles of America, I'm trying to remember exactly how he phrased it. It was 10 years ago, but he said something like, the average Christian has no idea, as he goes about his daily business in America, that everything happening in America is completely out of accord with the Orthodox Christian principles that he believes on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's like, the two are, it's like oil and water. Now, it's not oil and water because of there being a market system, because there's more liberty in terms of personal choices. It's oil and water because of the original idea of what we are setting up here, this experiment.
It's pluralism. It's pluralism.
That is absolutely out of accord with the idea of a revealed God and absolute truth.
But
it's really not. Yeah. So that's the pill that nobody can swallow. Everybody talks about red pill, black. I've got the real pill right here. Nobody wants to go here. Whoa. You know why people don't want to go there? I can tell you. Well, we all know why. Because you're not going to get as many clicks. You're not going to get as many.
Well, you won't prosper in the American system with that viewpoint, expressing that viewpoint. And everyone wants a seat at the table. And where the Catholics were better when they were poorer. Yeah.
I think it's greatly it's the great point. It's best exemplified in Trump. I'm an American, Americanist and a globalist.
Yeah, he's a typical New Yorker narcissist. He's the center of the universe, right? That's how they all think.
But that's what I'm saying is like that phrase is a great example.
I'm an Americanist globalist. But like you said,
no, I said it wrong. I'm a nationalist and a globalist. That's what he said in the campaign. It was a nationalist and a globalist.
But but Americanism was I guess you could say a beta test for globalism, because this all goes you said this goes back to the New Atlantis, and goes back to the American.
This is Bacon's book.
Yeah, and this is why ethnic Catholics, if they really know their doctrine, are completely out of place in America. This is why it was important to get them out of the ethnic neighborhoods, get them in the suburbs to become deracinated, completely cut off from their roots, and ultimately cut off from their faith. Because now, when they're cut off from their faith, they can become committed American. They become committed Americanists, which that really means is they worship Mammon.
Yeah, I have many Catholic friends that we still agree and we dialogue on this topic, because they have recognized the importance of ethnicity. Many people, obviously, who have read E. Michael Jones and so forth. So
you were talking about ethnicity in the beginning of the conversation. And it is an important thing, because now if you talk about ethnos or ethnicity, you are considered a retrograde. What are you talking about? White nationalism, aren't you? Well, whiteness itself is a degraded, deracinated concept, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, this is something that you can debate. This debate comes up a lot because it just depends on what you mean. I mean, I would agree that you could make a classification. Do you mean Caucasian peoples?
Yeah.
If you mean that, and that's what white is, then there's nothing wrong with saying that there is a classification, and it's real, of recognizable groups of people called Caucasians. And yes, even though there might be, 1/10 German and or 1/10, I don't know, like you might be 90% Caucasian and have, some American Indian, back.
Yeah.
But this is often an argument that's brought up. Well, so there's no such thing as white because everybody has some percent. Now, there is, because the variations of things on the edge of something, like variations of color of magenta or burnt sienna, that doesn't mean that there's no red. Okay.
Yeah.
And when I say that, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that there is a perfect blue-eyed Aryan person. It doesn't work like that. It's just merely a way of looking at groups of people that, by the way, anthropology for the longest time, mainline anthropology for the longest time, has used the classification of Mongoloid, Caucasoid, right? These classifications. So it shouldn't even be controversial, but the media has, and these idiot universities have made it controversial. I would actually say, and this is where everybody's going to call me a fruitcake, but because I believe the Genesis narrative, I actually think Genesis 10 is actually describing groups of people who spread out, right? And 10 is before Babel. So in Genesis 10, you have what's called the 70 nations who descend from the sons of Noah. I think white people are Japhethites. I think that's pretty obvious given the regions, roughly speaking, that Genesis 10 says the sons of Noah went into. So the Shemites, they went into the Middle East, and they're the Semites. This is pretty commonsensical, I would think. Does that mean I know everything? No, I don't exactly know how Asians fit into that. Maybe somebody one day will figure that out. Maybe there's some guy out there who does know that. I don't know. But, the Cushites we read about, they become the Egyptians. They become the people who went into Africa. And this is the descendants of Noah's son, Ham and Canaan. So I think that Genesis is correct when it says those things. And so if I say white people, I'm talking about the tribe that descends from this rough storyline. Sometimes people start talking about in terms of genetics and which is fine. And I'm sure that's a lot of that's true. But a lot of times people are also wanting to hearken back to some old stuff, some primeval history or something. And this is where it gets into all these mythologies and Teutonic Knights and all this. I don't believe any of that stuff. And I don't believe the Darwinian story. I think that's all nonsense, obviously. But so how do we, what do I offer? People want to ask me, well, if you don't believe in Darwinism, how do you, well, I read Genesis 10. I think it's accurate. And anybody who, disagrees, we can, we can have a debate on that. That's fine. But it actually makes a lot of sense, the stuff that's written in Genesis 10, because, you have even there, you have predictions of the Japhethites coming under and uniting with Shem. Now, I don't think that means what's the word I'm looking for? That's not like the British Empire becoming Judaized. It's a prophecy it's a messianic prophecy that the majority, of these people group will adopt the religion of Shem. That is the same as all the other messianic prophecies, that the Gentiles will convert to worship the God of Israel, Jesus. And that's not to say that no Hamites converted to Christ. Obviously they have. We have many famous black saints in the church. Yeah.
But in regards to America and the current debate going on now, obviously you have a lot of, I think a lot of it is a dialect that's being created. A lot of the Black Lives Matter is there to create the reaction of white nationalism, the reaction, and create a lot of conflict, that needless conflict, but they create this divide. Nevertheless, there's some. I do think there's a legitimate desire for certain ethnic groups to want to stick together and have a community of the same values and these things. And good example. Well, an example is that America at one time, prior to the Second World War, was largely a confederation of ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods, and communities. And it
was largely Caucasian. It was largely white. We can say that.
Yeah.
That's fine if you mean, yeah. And it also had many laws restricting immigration.
Yeah, immigration, the flow of people. Now, the problem with that is, even if those who advocate open borders for free immigration, is they're not taking into account weaponized migration and social engineering and these things. And
I have never once heard a leftist mention this topic, ever. It's obviously real. So that tells you everything right there.
It's not. You're not dealing with a free market or freedom here. You have multiple levels of coercion and going on here, namely fomented civil wars and economic exploitation.
Actually, they will.
Areas.
They will sometimes argue that the open borders. I mean, I hear libertarians every day saying open borders is libertarian because of markets. It's a market principle that you should have no borders. I mean, Marx supported free trade because he said it would wreck existing cultures.
Well, this is the idea of part of libertarianism being part of the Freemasonic dialectic that's planned. Right? I mean,
once you figure out the Jacobins and the Girondins are on the same team, really. Yeah. The Jeffersons and the Robespierres actually weren't enemies. They're kind of on the same team. Then it kind of, the whole American French Revolution thing kind of makes sense. I mean,
it was capitalism that created gay rights, as David Bowes wrote, right?
I think so. This came to the fore in the Cold War.
Yep.
Because, and again, the Soviet Party is ridiculous. Bertrand Russell is a big fan of it, so I'm not saying that. I mean, I hate Bertrand Russell. I'm not saying that it's good because it forbade homosexuality. But what I'm saying is that in the psychological warfare strategies, the West tried to use this as a point.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom equals gay rights. Therefore, that's how we beat Russia.
Like freedom equals modern art. Right.
And by the way, doesn't that actually I mean, I think it was probably intended to backfire as a way. No, I know it was. So it's just like in Ukraine or in Russia, because Russell said a long time ago, we got to abort these damn Russians, we got to kill more of the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And he says we got to introduce all of this dark psychological warfare to destroy this people group. What happens is they are told in the psych warfare that this is your right that's being suppressed.
Yeah.
It's your right to be gay. It's your right to have abortions. You are being suppressed because you can't kill your offspring.
Yeah.
And it's so dumb, but at the same time, it actually works because, this is that dark power behind degrading people and decapitating people.
Yeah. My point was as much the ethnic demographics of the United States today was not free markets. There was a lot of social engineering brought about through fomented wars. Little thing called the so-called American Civil War, the destruction of the South, and then you have the economic destruction of the South, and all of a sudden you have all this cheap labor that you can import up into the North to break the unions and these things. And at the same time, they're intentionally putting these sharecroppers from the South into these concentrated, Polish neighborhoods in and around Detroit. And it's not as if they didn't foresee a problem; they wanted a problem because they wanted to break up the neighborhood. And same thing. And a lot of people, the Jews were involved in this, the Quakers were involved in this, the Blanchard brothers, just a lot of the WASP and these things, because basically it was a way to break up the Catholic ethnic neighborhoods because they saw Catholic power as a threat to the American century. These Catholic ethnics, and the idea was get them into the suburbs, and you get them into this these subsidized loans, these bigger houses. They're in debt forever, but they think they get a big house and then they got to buy a car, then two cars, and this sets into motion this debt-driven, inflation-driven consumerism.
Right. So this would kind of be more of a union of the WASP elite and the
Jews, yeah,
power
going against the Catholics. It's sort of this. It's Michael Jones's theory: the three ethnic groups: WASP, Jews, and Catholics in the United States. And you have to understand this ethnic. Roughly, if you look at these ethnic groups, you got to understand the politics, and the demographic warfare that went on in the 20th century. My point is that the current situation now, and notions of white identity are a product of social engineering, and it's sort of a negative identity. I guess it's been described to me. I think it's a fair description of it, to all this virulent anti. They can't say whiteness doesn't exist when there's been a concerted campaign against it for the past 30 years. Right. And we see it now with commercials, and not just whiteness; it's also male. Male authority. So it's sort of a white male thing.
So masculinity is toxic, but it's a social male is a social construct.
Yeah, and at the same time, they brutalized femininity by throwing women into the workplace, calling it liberation and these things, and this destroys the family. And this, I've made the point that everyone talks about, the wage gap, and how I think going in the 1970s, women earned 40 cents for every dollar a man earned, and now it's like 78 cents for every dollar. And they say this is progress. I don't think that's not progress at all. That's a negative index. It's a terrible index because it's come at a huge price. The deplorable decline in family life and the rearing of children and these things and the problems we're seeing now. Of course, this is all liberation because all the sex gay stuff and transgender stuff and all this stuff, that's the libertarians say this is all liberation. People just being free to what they are. No, this is a product of the sexual revolution, the destruction of the family, destruction of home life, the fact that kids are raised in warehouses called public schools, are subject to all the psychological warfare of Madison Avenue and Hollywood. They're subject to more abuse because they're living in broken homes. And this is the stuff that we've talked about, was planned out with Planned Parenthood in the late 60s. It's all psychological warfare. It's not freedom.
And to go along with what I said earlier, Russell says, and then Miles Copeland says, and we can include Miles Copeland's book in the Globalist book series too. Miles Copeland says that they knew that if they industrialized and made Egypt rich, it would reduce their population. Mm-hmm. Russell says the same thing. He says, if we can industrialize, by the way, a lot of people think erroneously, they'll say, the exportation of industry to China and the industrialization of China by the Western elites was a plot to destroy the West. It kind of was. Mm-hmm. But Russell is very clear that it's also a way to modernize China to eventually bring down the Chinese population, because he literally says the Russians and the Chinese and all the Eurasian populations are vermin.
Yeah.
So I'm stressing that the technocrats know that when you industrialize and make a place wealthy, the tendency is for them to get lazy and decadent and degenerate, and then to not have children because they're lazy and they're controlled by their passions. It's unfortunate, but they know this from a psychological warfare standpoint. Miles Copeland writes it in his book.
Yeah, and they're seeing generations ahead.
Yes, Copeland had it. Remember that they had actuaries by the PR companies and the CIA, and him being the lead for the CIA. They had actuaries of how long it would take for if NASA went with this plan to get to lower population in Egypt. That is insane, but that's how they do it. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, he said this is a setup, a stage. You bring in modernization and these things, and then that disrupts traditional Egyptian culture, and they get.
And they had it in phases. It was actuaried in phases. Like, okay, in this phase, do this, then this phase, and then hopefully by, I don't remember what the year was, 2000 or 2020, we can have the Egyptian population down 20%. Or it's literally actuaried out that way. And then when you go, like I did last week or this past week, and you look at the Davos documents, and it's almost like you're dealing with robots. It's almost like who could write this stuff?
Yeah.
Like how do you write a thing that's all calculations of bringing down population, and you don't realize that you're dealing with actual human beings? That it blows my mind. I can't fathom that.
Well, that's like Henry Kissinger, National Security Study Memorandum 200 back in 1974, where he talks about the curbing
third world,
reducing third of population through starvation, and they would do this through sort of an economic strangulation through debt, and of course this was the I think, factored into the fomented the so-called energy crisis when the prices were.
This is Bilderberg OPEC crisis,
yeah,
right?
When they raised oil prices by 400%, and there's a lot of things was, this made a lot of ventures profitable overnight. This enabled them to put up the petrodollar, and then they recycling dollars in the U.S. Chase Manhattan Bank and making sure that the Saudis bought U.S. Treasuries so they get this vast pool of credit. At the same time, it would the explosion in energy prices would curb third world development, which would then free up the resource. This is how they see the world, because they don't, they see everything. They don't see it dynamically, and they want to them it's seizing the resources. The world is a limited ball, and they have to control what's here, and they have to make sure that the poor brown people don't have, they have to get rid of them.
Every globalist book that I've read makes that point, that the resources are done. By the way, Bertrand Russell was saying peak oil way before any of the neocons were saying peak oil. Isn't that crazy?
It wasn't that King Hubbard came up with that idea. It sold to the Rockefellers, and this became a basis for the oil depletion tax deduction and things like that. Yeah.
I hadn't heard that. I knew that it was, obviously the neocons were all touting it, and I remember.
Yeah, but, King Hubbard is the other guy for technocracy. Him and what was the other guy? Howard Scott. That started technocracy at Columbia University in the 1930s, and he started pushing this peak oil thing.
Well, that's where Russell got it, I guess.
Yeah, it's probably, and then it was pushed by Rockefeller. Okay. And this is the whole idea about calling it fossil fuel. This is all this neuro-linguistic programming. Dinosaur
juice, like Chris said.
Yeah, dinosaur juice and these things. And, well, there are only so many dinosaurs, there's only so much oil. It's funny because it's the Russians that came up with the abiotic theory, which turns out might be true. Which gets back to the whole because this factors in all geopolitics. And remember the idea of going into the...
Well, the crucial thing about geopolitics is controlling energy.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's actually discussed at Davos. They have like a triad that's always discussed: energy, security, population, something like that.
And you don't want the Russians and the Chinese, developing a Silk Road or a pipeline, because then they get outside the Anglo-American dollar system, right? And so
exactly. It'd be like trying to use barter outside the dollar. If that ever grew, it would be potentially a competitor, which, this is the argument for Bitcoin, at least at this point, the argument. So,
and that gets back to the old Mackinder doctrine of controlling the sea power, controlling the land power, because you want them you want them dependent on the sea lanes, not developing internally, because they develop internally, then they get out of your control. And now it has a lot to do with satellites and controlling transactions.
Exactly. I'm trying to think of the title of when I write a geopolitical book, it'll be something like Babel, Empire of Mammon and Sodomy. I'm not joking, because then it'll end up on like a bunch of gay sites or something. It'll be mistitled, and people will be like, "Oh, it's not what I thought I was getting."
Sodomy and usury. But isn't the is the European community, isn't their flag like the Tower of Babel or something?
There was a poster that was made up in the 90s that was supposed to be the iconic image. Yeah. It may be a flag. I can't remember if it's a flag, but I thought the flag was just like the stars.
Does the Bank of International Settlements look like Babel or something? I feel like there was something.
It does look like a tower. It looks like that Tower of Babel, yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the central banks owned by who? Well, we can't tell you. It's a matter of international security, I guess. I can't say national security, but you really don't know who owns that. I'm sure it's responsible people are in charge of the adults. So nothing.
It's the experts. Don't worry. It's the experts. They'll take care of it.
So, but you mentioned
it's your new hierarchy that
that's the funny thing.
Hierarchy, and now you have a new hidden shadow hierarchy.
That's the funny thing is we're told that monarchs and bishops are evil hierarchy. They're going to enslave us, arbitrary rule. But then we're stuck with the secret of Federal Reserve or the Supreme Court, or
now you have Emperor Rothschild now.
Yeah, so. He's banking families, and okay, we're free because I can vote if I want to.
Yeah,
I can cast a vote. I can press a button in the computer and hope it counts my vote properly. We're free.
The other thing about monarchy too, I want to mention that a lot of people don't understand is that it itself is kind of an icon of the family, and it's very difficult to get across or to argue to a population that their families need to be destroyed when the people in power are a family. Now, we live in a supposed democracy republic that's moving into the technocracy, which it was always intended to be, and they're going to tell us, they already are telling us, that it's bad to have families and so forth. It's bad to be a man. But then remember that thing that people were talking about with Justin Trudeau and all these other people, these EU people, like they don't have any families, like they're just And I will admit, I'm being a hypocrite. I don't actually have a family. I actually will be most likely getting married soon. So
congratulations!
Thank you. So
does the world know the lucky lady, or keep it secret for her benefit?
Intrepid researchers could, I'm sure, figure out who. Okay. But anyway, so. Point being is that you have a kind of an iconic image of the family, and again, that's not to say that it's always going to be perfect, but any system that anybody argues for, for being in place or whatever, even if it's libertarian or even if it's minimalist, minarchist state or whatever, you're going to get people running stuff, and the people running shit can always be fanatical. So, this is even something ancient philosophers and, Aristotle debated the best form of government, monarchy, republic, democracy. Aquinas debated the best forms of government and so forth. So the form of government itself is not necessarily the salvation, because it's just a form. It's just a way of doing things. Mm-hmm. But there are forms that match up better to the natural state of human beings. And I know natural state is a little bit of a loaded term. I don't mean by natural state, like Renaissance theorists. I don't mean Rousseau. I don't mean social contract. I don't mean any of that. I mean it in the biblical theological sense that I believe. What I'm saying is it's very difficult to destroy those kinds of things with that image there. Mm-hmm. And that's why the technocrats have to use the pop culture as a new icon. It's a new iconography to replace old icons and old iconography of the pop culture garbage that I've been writing about, and to replace that image of what we strive for with all of this debased, degenerate, gross, nasty, Katy Perry Gaga crap.
Yeah. The as far as something like a political entity like the United States, as problematic as its founding was, with all the Freemasonic imagery and ultimately what it really is as an experiment. Whatever problem is represented or presented, I think it was ameliorated by the fact it was highly decentralized, and its decentralization worked towards practicality, and that's where the people prospered. And America became more problematic on the world scene as it became more centralized, particularly in the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War. It became the empire, and it's this centralization and the destruction of states' rights. Of course, that's the war between the states, the American Civil War, and these things, and that
was the CFR plan, was to transition. It was the stated plan to transition America into the engine of globalism.
Yeah, through war, by the way. That's what the Dodd,
right.
The Carnegie Foundation. There's the minutes that Norman Dodd and Kathy Casey exposed about successive crises and wars. And of course, we've had that: First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the warfare state. And this is all part of NSC 68. This idea that the whole economy, Keynesian militarism, these things based on debt, which requires the enthronement of the U.S. dollar, is that way you have perpetual debt by force feeding the world your inflation. But even when you talk about Catholic doctrine, and they talk about whether it's distributism or some sort of Catholic society, what's the good society, and a lot of people will look at it and say, well, that sounds like socialism to me. But actually, Catholicism has the principle of subsidiarity. So it in itself believes in practical decentralization. How we govern society, so making sure that the local things should be taken care of at the local level, and you move on up as things get more complicated. This
was let me recall. It's been 10 years since I interacted with distributists. I used to be buddies with one of the guys who was I think he was like one of the early founding guys of the Distributist Review, and is it Rerum Novarum that deals with the
that was the encyclical in 1891.
Is that about workers though?
Workers' rights, yeah. Leo the 13th, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But again, it's this idea of basically of a social model, which takes into account you need the dynamism of the market. You need free labor, work, business, and these things. But there's also consciousness in the community by taking care of the community. This is the balance of the one and the many. And subsidiarity balances that without any ugly ideologies, right? Without these ugly ideologies. And it's through this model that you would probably solve a lot of the this gets in the idea of a good society, because you wouldn't get businessmen in industry exploiting cheap labor, because they would have a love for their community, a loyalty to the community to provide fair wages and take care of their workers. This is a whole way of looking at life. You're not exploiting labor. You're not going to radicalize women, make them feminists. So in a generation they want to go and work in your factory and destroy the family. You can have the wages because you have women working too.
This is right. Yeah. Okay. This reminded me too, going back to actually the beginning of the conversation. This is actually one of the arguments of the Frankish thesis, is that the excesses of feudalism were in part what gave rise to the modern idea of exploitation of workers. So, for example, Marx will talk about feudalism transitioning into free market capitalism in the period of Locke and David Ricardo and all those guys and Adam Smith. And the idea was that so the Lord has the castle, and he can kind of just take from the serfs and the peasant farmers what he wants, because he gives the protection of the walls of the castle or whatever, or the troops, right? But so he can do whatever he can exploit them, because they're in a way his workers. And so really the idea is, it just transitions into a new kind of lord. It's not a dude who has a bunch of knights in a castle. It's a guy who has a logging factory, and he has a bunch of workers or something.
And he hires Pinkertons.
Eventually that does happen, right?
Yeah.
So, but what's interesting is that and I think James Kelly mentions this in his book, but if he doesn't mention it, it's mentioned in the various books on the Frankish thesis. But the idea is that it was the Franks who kind of pioneered the idea, and I'm not saying that I know this for certain. It's just an interesting theory that I've kind of, been looking into and have toyed with for 10 years or so. But the idea is that maybe the Franks were the ones who kind of had this idea of, I'm the Lord, I deserve a castle. You pay me. So in other words, he's basically not doing a lot unless he's getting attacked. And so it's that model of being a parasite. And that's different from other forms of how things would run. So maybe even the Roman Imperium, didn't run that way. I'm not saying that Roman Imperium was ideal. I'm just giving you different models of how societies have functioned over time.
Yeah, I mean, a modern example of a conscientious business leader, captain of industry, and he isn't perfect at all, but was the idea of Fordism. Where you pay good wages and you deal with organized labor, but then inevitably the bean counters, the Newtonians, the British Imperial took over as well. Taylorism. Let's lower the costs, increase efficiency, and there's all types of economic rationalizations for these things. And you get all this cheap labor down south. Let's send this up. Work with our friends in the railroads, ship them up north at cheap, and flood the labor market up here. And of course, they also have the rationalization of the war mobilization, because there's now a shortage of labor because they've conscripted millions of men to go into the armed forces. Either way, it's like large scale social planning, and we're given a world which didn't come about rationally. It wasn't like people made choices. This wasn't markets working. Everywhere around you, there's coercion. There's all types of exploitation going on, and the difficulty is trying to unravel these things, sort these things out, because each level,
right,
you'll get people are going to have legitimate grievances, but they don't really understand the source of their grievance. Why.
I do want to add too that part of the argument. I forgot this aspect of the argument. I'm not meaning to change the subject, but this was crucial. Also, was that part of the explanation for what happened in Europe is that this is the model that came to Europe that was different from the way that the European tribes previously operated. Mm-hmm. So I guess in the paganism, and I'm not saying that makes paganism de facto correct, but you kind of have this model of the lord and the castle sort of imposed on, from the Franks, imposed on the European peoples. Mm-hmm. The theory is that this might be where you get the modern feudal and capitalist period rulers of Europe, that they come out of this model, which is different from the traditional, more organic model of how European peoples would have operated. In other words, we wouldn't have been as pure. I mean, yeah, there could always be some tribal chieftain abusing people, but we wouldn't have we wouldn't have the Queen of England in this giant banking empire working with international Zionist bankers and the Rothschilds to basically suck off the whole planet.
And laundering money at the Isle of Wight or something, wherever those the Jersey banks, I guess, at the Isle of Jersey, where they
Island of Jersey. Oh yeah. That's
or Monaco.
He's everywhere.
The casinos of Monaco.
Man, I don't even know. That's a whole other thing. I mean, that would be a great. I don't know about that. I know what Monaco is, but I'm saying I don't know like the intrigues of Monaco except for the King of Monaco and Grace Kelly story.
Yeah, her alleged murder. Yeah, interesting. So yeah, it's something else. So, anything else, Jay? Oh, you mentioned you're having this debate. What's this? You're trying to get a debate with alt-right people?
I put out a feeler, as I often do, for a debate, and Nick Fuentes at America First Media responded and has said that he will do a debate on Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. He wants to do it February 1st. He hasn't given a time yet, so hopefully that will take place. And then the fairly large channel Warski Live, Andy Warski, who hosts a lot of alt-right people, and he actually hosted the Richard Spencer Sargon debate, the debate between alt-right and classical liberalism, which was like the #1 stream in the world for a while, and has had like 500,000 views now after a week or two. So it's a very big channel. That would be a lot of exposure. I'm looking forward to that. I did speak briefly in some tweets, and they did mention on their show to have me on. So hopefully that'll go through. We will most likely debate not anything alt-right, but probably atheism and theism. I think the guy JF, who's his co-host, is a nihilist. And so there's possibility maybe of some other people who affirm nihilism.
So he's a conscientious nihilist?
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people are default nihilist. I mean, they don't know it, but they actually identifies as a nihilist?
As I understand, I've only listened to a couple of JF's debates, and he's a sharp guy, but very much in the vein of scientism. So his graduate work was neuroscience. So he's going to be coming at it, from a sort of biologicist perspective. So I don't know how he did have some he had to distribute us on, actually, and he had Nick on, and they had a debate about theism. So there is the possibility of having that debate. He's not so mired in scientism that he won't listen to to a theist. But anyway, so I'm looking forward. Hopefully these debates will go forward. I'm afraid of people backing out, but we'll see.
Okay. And of course, you have you're working on your new book, which is probably be ready by the summertime, you think?
Yeah, that's what I'm shooting for. I don't think that'll be too hard. It should be. It's mainly just a matter of sticking all this stuff in there, and I do have to do some more writing. But yeah, I would say, what is this? This is January. I'd say I would be done with it by 3 or 4 weeks. And
then you deliver the manuscript.
Yeah, and then I'm sure Chris will.
And then the fun begins.
Yeah, he'll say make a bunch of sidebars, which will be another 2 or 3 weeks. So anyway, but yeah, I'm sure it'll be by summer. I would think that would be pretty easy to shoot for.
And the focus of the sequel, Esoteric Hollywood, is going to be, how would it be different from the first one? Just more analysis? Or?
Great question. This one is a little different. So I've decided to, in the first chapter, we're basically going to move from the real to the crazy. So in the first section, I should say, we're going to be dealing with the mob, with spies, with black markets, and stuff that is in film that you and I have talked about in the past, God type stuff. And then we're going to move out into the next ring of crazy in the little more challenging, dubious area. Not dubious for me, but for what most people would find unbelievable. Mind control. We're going to have a lengthy section dealing with mind control in film, real examples of mind control. I put up, I think, a sample section of this area of the book in regard to John C. Lilly and movies like Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson. And then we're going to, but that will be a lengthy chapter because there's actually a plethora of movies about mind control. So I'm having to narrow it down, like what I want to put in there, what I don't. There's so many. Then we're going to move out to a strange topic that probably most people won't expect, but I'm putting it in there on purpose. Weather control and geoengineering. That actually comes up in some strange, funny, and interesting movies.
It wasn't there one last year with it didn't do well about geoengineering?
No, I'm not going to put that one there because that movie is terrible. But people have said, are you going to put the Michael Bay movie in there? I might mention it as a paragraph, like make fun of it or something, but I'm actually thinking of things that are a little better than that. So I won't say which ones. You'll have to wait and see. And then the final section of the book will be Hollywood transhumanism. And so a little different than what we talked about in the first Esoteric Hollywood. That did come up a couple times, but this is going to be different. We're going to deal with new films, other films, things that you wouldn't expect. And I think it's going to be fun. I want it to be different. I don't want people to feel like they're reading the same book over again.
Yeah.
So I want to have different material, different movies, new material, surprise stuff. There will be some goofy stuff here too. Maybe a little more satire, a little more silliness in the midst of all this craziness. So hopefully it will be a trilogy. Eventually we'll have three books. But another reason for the last section being Hollywood transhumanism is I'm not 100% positive if I can exactly say the deets yet, but I do have some speaking engagements, one of which will be fairly prominent place and audience. I'll have to, maybe next time we talk, I'll mention the details of it, but the subject matter I'll be speaking on will be Hollywood transhumanism.
Okay.
That was what was asked for, since I talk about quite a bit. And then also the possibility I might be speaking at a philosophy conference, believe it or not. I don't want to exactly give all the deets on that yet, but that might be happening this year as well.
Great. Okay. Well, Jay, I want to thank you for coming back on.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me promote all this stuff.
Oh, certainly. No problem. That's Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. You can go to his website, check out his material, and if you like it, I recommend people subscribing to his work. It's $4.95 a month, $60 a year, right? You got that right?
It is, yeah, and had a lot more subscribers over the last year. We're growing still. The tutoring has been going well. I've had quite a few people do personal tutoring, which you can sign up for on the Patreon page. Most people tend to just do it directly to me. It doesn't matter to me how you want to do it. And we do, basically 2-hour blocks of discussing, geopolitics, philosophy, theology, history, whatever people want to talk about. And I think that's everything. Other than Hollywood Decoded. Yeah. Yes. By the way, if you do want a season 2, so when you go to the Gaia page and you're watching it, leave a comment about I want a season 2. So that would actually probably help, with them in their decision making on whether there will be a season 2.
Yeah, of course. And of course, your book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, is still for sale. You buy that, support. You can buy them directly from you. You still sign a copy?
Oh yeah, I still mail them out every week, several copies, at least probably 10 or 11 copies a week. So it's still going strong. Great.
Okay. Yeah. Go out. If you haven't gotten that book, go out and get it, or get it for your friends and family. It's an easy read, very enjoyable read, and it's very very illuminating, if I may use an unfortunate term. But it's a great book. I highly recommend it. So, well, Jay, thanks a lot.
Very much.
I'll let you go. Right. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll be in touch, and go from there.
All right. Thanks.
Take it easy. Bye-bye.
He grinned and he shook my hand, and no was all he said. So take a load off Fanny, take a load for free, take a load off Fanny, and you put the load right on me.
Picked up my bags, I went looking for a place to hide. When I saw old Carmen and the devil walking side by side, said, come on, Carmen, come on, let's go downtown. She said, I gotta go, but my friend can't stick around. Take a load off, Fanny.
you're right if you take back my time. I said, wait a minute, Chester, you know I'm a peaceful man. Said, that's okay, son, wash your feet and wherever you can. Take a load off, baby. Take a load for free. Take a load off, baby. Put the load right around me. I'm on a case of me